Hello, good evening, everybody. Very welcome to the inaugural evening of the conference Navigation Beyond Vision. It's a great pleasure to see everyone here on this Friday evening, and we have heard that the city is partly already blocked in terms of public transportation because of the half marathon that is going to take place in the next couple of days. So it's really great to see you all here. And of course, also a specific and heartfelt thank you to all the speakers and contributors to this conference that agreed to join us for these 2 days, who have been traveling from Berlin, from Geneva, and from London. And it's a great pleasure that you all have been agreeing to participate in the process to research navigation as an image formatting epistemic condition, or as a techno-political visuality of the 21st century. My name is Doreen Mende. I'm one of the members of the Harun Farocki Institut, together with Volker Pantenburg and Tom Hollert. We are running the Harun Farocki Institut. This is Brian Kuan Wood, one of the editors of e-flux journal, together with Julieta Aranda and Anton Di Dogle. We have been working on this iteration, and Brian is going to elaborate a bit more what role and what kind of context this also conference today came about. The conference Navigation Beyond Vision is the continuation of a long-term collaboration between e-flux journal and the Harun Farocki Institute. Shortly after Harun Farocki's untimely death in late July 2014, e-flux journal issue number 59 enabled by care and kinship the editing of 17 essays, letters, souvenirs, eulogies, notes, and images for paying tribute to Harun Farocki's work as a filmmaker and writer. The issue number 59 also provided a space for mourning the loss of Farocki's extraordinary capacity to create a social intellectual space that he had built from his films and writings as an archive of passion for studying and practicing visual literacy, a safe space offered by an organic worker intellectual, where we would feel comfortable as well as challenged to share ideas, where we would feel invited to speak politics, and where we would feel accommodated to foster friendship, to embark on the work to politicize image regimes, to resist by analyzing the militarization of the gaze, and to train our vocabularies for thinking with images. The conference also is the continuation of the collaboration with the Haus of the World Cultures that hosted many Farocki-related events and exhibitions, for example, during the Berlin Documentary Forum in 2012 and 2014, the Harun Farocki Memorial in 2015, as well as the inaugural evening of the Farocki Now Academy as part of the multi-part Farocki retrospective in 2017. Thank you.
It's also a great pleasure for e-flux, which also includes KK Nielsen, editor-in-chief of e-flux journal, and Emel Issa, who is our head of public programs, who worked really hard to bring this together. It's been a real pleasure for all of us to collaborate with the Harun Farocki Institute and the HKV on Navigation Beyond Vision. Should be said that it's the third chapter in a series of 4 conferences celebrating the start of e-flux journal's second decade of publishing. The final conference, entitled Art After Culture, will take place at e-flux in New York on June 14th and 15th, and it will ask how or whether art can still gain access to something larger than what we call the culture that an artist or our dominant historical conception of art, what they were born into. The first 2 conferences took place earlier this year. The first was organized with Witty de Wit in Rotterdam on exile, and it asked how nationhood and belonging are born from diasporic sensibilities of estrangement. The second conference, the Twilight Symposium, Science Fiction Inside Colonialism, was organized with Kader Attia and La Colonie in Paris, and asked how we might read science fiction through the lens of post-colonialism and vice versa. For the conference, beginning tonight and continuing tomorrow. It has been really a big pleasure and joy to think together with Tom and Doreen about the question of navigation, especially in relation to Harun Farocki's late interest in the subject. After they explained the topic to Julieta Randa and I, it was immediately clear that Harun's sense of cinematic concepts and sensibilities was absolutely crucial for understanding how computational spaces and perceptions work. We are often under the spell of the rational and absolute claims of machines, but in fact, cinema in some ways still remains our greatest techno-visual apparatus. And perhaps that means that any further image regime, whether surveillance-based, biometric, or otherwise, would at some point need to still pass through cinematic vision in order to come into being as an image in the first place.
In his residency at the IKKM at Bauhaus University in Weimar in 2014, Harun Farocki researched the changed conditions for operating the frame of images under the rules of computer animation. While the principle of montage as a political image practice of the 20th century relied on the static frame to create an impression that there is always more than meets the eye, creating an access beyond the frame of images, a kind of third space, for emancipating the gaze from representational norms regarding gender and race by forms of visual subjectivation, we have to ask today, what could be a political image practice of the 21st century for questioning and investigating the principle of navigation that updates, calculates, and incorporates the frame excessively and continuously into the image-making process? Or as Farocki wrote in his outline of his research project, Computer Animation Rules, and I quote, "For over 100 years, photography and film were the leading media. From the start, they served not only to inform and entertain, but were also media of scientific research and documentation. That's also why these reproduction techniques were associated with the notions of objectivity and contemporaneity, whereas images created by drawing and painting indicated subjectivity and the transrational. Apparently," Farocki continues, "today computer animation is taking the lead to what you would call to install a new ruling class of images. Following the Gulf War in 1991, which was a very important also event for Farocki to think about the phantom image, the operational image, the US military decided not to film the determining battle of 23 Easting, but to document it by using computer animation." He also continues then to talk about a computer game, Virtual Battle Space 2, that was invented in 2007 in order to be used as training military simulation games in the US Army and also the Bundeswehr to train soldiers to operate land, sea, but also air vehicles to the concept of real virtuality, not virtual reality, but real virtuality. But the military training programs that are referred to here are based on real geographic data. One can navigate within the program, walk through the landscape or drive and view the landscape from various arbitrary viewpoints. The instructors can place explosive traps or enemies. Fire can be opened on those taking part in the exercise, and they can return fire. The weapon's firing range is equivalent to the distance in reality. These features apparently compensate for the lack of photorealistic representation. A computer animation is not just the simulation of appearances, but also a data gadget that makes the fastest possible calculations and visualizes them immediately. A computer animation is less, and this is very important now, is less a reproduction and more a production or creation of a model world, quote end. We follow up on Farocki's concern to research and question the conditions, problems, pitfalls, and potencies of modeling the world instead of representing it that navigation confronts us with. Arguably, navigation poses a paradigm shift challenge to montage, as it quite successfully aspires to replace montage as the dominant mode of techno-political visuality today. we propose today and tomorrow to debate that the computer-animated navigable images, which constitute the new ruling class of images, and call for new tools of analysis and practice. Drawing on Alexander Galloway's concept of actionable objects that he elaborates in his book of Gaming Algorithmic Cultures, I think 2006 or 2009, where, Farocki studied his work a lot in his residency, we further the questions that Farocki began to ask. How does the shift from montage to navigation alter the way images and art making operate as models of political action and modes of political intervention? Oh, you're already here? Okay. How do navigational paradigms in virtual as well as offline environments increasingly inform the politics of the image? If navigation puts ontological pressure on the static frame of a photographic episteme or cinematic image, then how are our concepts of political action, visual literacy, and collective intervention also pressured to surpass or perform model worlds? Or quoting a recent dialogue between Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the radical monarchs from East Oakland on March 10 during the South-Southwest Festival Conference and Festival in Austin. Question from the audience. Hi, my name is Lupita. Hi, I'm Amia.
We are the radical monarchs from East Oakland. Our question is, what advice would you give to young girls of color who want to get into politics?
AOC says, thank you. The advice that I give is, stop trying to navigate systems of power and start building your own power.
The conference is organized in 5 parts. We will start today with an opening lecture with James Bridle and Hito Steyerl, moderated by Brian Kuan Wood, who is me. We will continue tomorrow, April 6th, starting at 11 a.m., with an introduction by Kay Kane Nielsen and Tom Hollard, followed by 3 panels. Panel 1 will start at 11:15 a.m., Sensory Countermappings, with Anselm Franke, Jennifer Gabris, Laura Lopresti, Mariana Silva, aka Inhabitants, Nikolai Smirnov, and moderated by Tom Hollard. This first panel of the day departs from the need to debate the means of navigation in a field of tension between the techno-political matrix, the geo-ecological condition, and the limits of the visual. Panel 2 is entitled The Tasks of Abstract Space, and this begins at 2:15 p.m. tomorrow after lunch. This panel will feature Ramon Amaro, Matteo Pasquinelli, and Patricia Reed, and it will be moderated by myself. This panel will aim to think of mathematics as tools for world making, and thus to confront human reasoning with its blindness as well as its accountabilities historically and practically. Panel 3 at 5 p.m. will close the day with extra image violence. This panel will feature Maïté Chenier, Charles Heller, Oraib Toucan, and it will be moderated by Doreen Mende. This panel will engage with the non-representational promise of an image exceeding the frame, with the objective to discuss the potency of navigation as a possible social practice to interrupt vicious circles of violence. We're also sorry for those who came for thinking Ben Vickers or Vasilis Tianos would be here, and Gloria Menon. Unfortunately, they could not make it, so it's important to note that for those planning to come tomorrow. And the day will end with an introduction by Julieta Aranda and a keynote reflection on the conference's contributions by Kojo Eshin, which will be at 7:15 p.m. and that will close the day for tomorrow. I think it's also important to mention, I think after we finish today, the bar will be open for an hour if we finish on time, so we can also gather for additional Q&A after that.
And of course, last but not least, we would like to express our heartfelt thanks to the House of the World Cultures who are hosting this conference, particularly Bernd Scherer, Anselm Franke, and Dunya Salan. And also we would really, from Farocki Institute, but everyone, Amal Issa from e-flux Journal and e-flux, who has been tremendously helpful and patient in preparing all the organizational and intellectual labor. And also to Antje Ehmann, who is also here for being a friend and a fellow traveler with the Harun Farocki Institute, Volker Pantenburg, and of course also Elsa Dissen of the Harun Farocki Institute, and Alima de Graaf, who, without Elsa and Alima, we couldn't do this as well. And I also would like to express my thanks to the students of the CCC research program in HED in Genève, who have been embarking also on the question of navigation in various seminars and also contributing to the reflections. So thank you very much to everyone who contributed to these 2 days, before and after. Thank you.
Hi everyone, it's me again, still me. I'm still here. So if cybernetic systems have profoundly confused the distinction between consciousness of the world and control over that world, then what was a map? Suddenly, this visual recording of centuries of topological research and territorial appetites reappears as a self-fulfilling prophecy par excellence, a blunt political instrument for writing the future. Today, the trillion-fold increase in processing power experienced over the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st is slowing down. Yet, the ways of using and exploiting or inhabiting this enormous power are still being explored. The power to communicate, to organize the transportation of goods and people across distances, to register and synchronize images and changes in value as they enter and exit various zones have radically expanded the way that space and time are expressed and perceived. Yet these extensions are only possible through the medium of alphanumeric or mathematical calculations, which move through space and time with an ease that objects or human bodies cannot match. As Donna Haraway wrote in the early 90s, our best machines are made of sunshine. They are all light and clean because they are nothing but signals, electromagnetic waves, a section of a spectrum, and these machines are eminently portable, mobile, a matter of immense human pain in Detroit and Singapore. People are nowhere near so fluid, being both material and opaque. While objects in human bodies are distressed or damaged by the pressures of movement, we could say that numbers always arrive at their destination just as they were at their origin. A 5 stays a 5 anywhere in the world, just as it was a 5 3,000 years ago. However, it's important to note that when mathematical vectors are used for modeling, they are not able to plot space in the same way as time. Henri Bergson is known for insisting on the primacy of lived duration in experiencing time. And he wrote, "As we have said, when one wishes to prepare a glass of sugared water, one is obliged to wait until the sugar melts. This necessity for waiting is the significant fact. It shows that if one can cut out from the universe the systems for which time is only an abstraction, a relation, a number, the universe itself becomes something different. If we could grasp it in its entirety, inorganic but interwoven with organic beings, we should see it ceaselessly taking on forms as new, as original, as unforeseeable as our states of consciousness. Time is extremely difficult to model through mathematical abstractions, whose absolute vectors cannot account for changes that occur. Space, on the other hand, can be assumed as being more absolute, stable, and linear. Bergson adds that when we evoke time, it is space which answers our call, for our understanding of temporal change often suffers from having the properties of space prematurely projected onto it. This can be quite easily imagined through the utility of Google Maps, whose coordinates are usually accurate. One's destination rarely moves or changes position in the course of our traveling towards it. However, in time, space as well as space, as well as one's own locality and location are constantly changing. In tonight's keynote panel for Navigation Beyond Vision, James Bridle and Hito Steyerl each present their own recent research. In James Bridle's new book, New Dark Age, he looks extensively at how John von Neumann and other pioneers of today's computers developed some of the earliest forms of computation by attempting to predict weather patterns, literally computing the planet or our own life-sustaining biosphere, inferring and extrapolating the unknown from the known. Perhaps not unrelated to this, James has also performed a number of tests on the ambient contextual constraints of autonomous and self-driving cars, and will present some of his work based on that tonight. Weather prediction is a topic that Hito and I have had a lot of fun with. Tonight, Hito will tell campfire stories about pyromancy, divination using fire, and machine prediction based on some homebrew AI she has developed for a new film she is working on. The tool is similar to the way Google has used neural nets to stochastically infer what images are supposed to look like. Some of you may have seen the 2011 film Limitless with Bradley Cooper. In the film, he finds a drug that unlocks all of his unused cognitive capacity, turning him into a kind of cognitive and sensory Superman. But the way the film portrays space is extremely interesting because he can propel his vision down streets far beyond the horizon, simply by extrapolating the unseen from the seen, almost like fast-forwarding a film strip, or as if Google Maps had been made out of a kind of human intuition on steroids. And, in fact, that could actually be the case. But I will let our speakers tell us more. By way of brief introduction, very brief introduction, Hito works as a filmmaker and author. She lives in Berlin. James Bridle is an artist and writer working across technologies and disciplines. His artworks have been commissioned by galleries and institutions and exhibited worldwide and on the internet. His writing on literature, culture, and networks has appeared in magazines and newspapers including Wired, Domus, Cabinet, Atlantic, New Statesman, Guardian, Observer, and many others in print and online. He lectures regularly at conferences, universities, and other events. New Dark Age, his book about technology, knowledge, and the end of the future, was published by Verso in 2018. Please join me in warmly welcoming Hito Steyerl.
Thank you so much, Brian, for this wonderful introduction, and thanks also to the Harun Farocki Institut and e-flux for having me. Having said that, it's going to be a bit chaotic tonight. I was forced to restructure my presentation basically last minute, so what you're going to see is a sort of ramble about a tool I have been using recently, which I call the political pyromancer. And I'm going to talk about this tool and trying to extract some ideas around it, mainly about navigation in relation to time. How does one navigate time, and how does this relate to neural network-based prediction? So let me first show you this video, which is a recording made with the pyromancer. And what you see here is literally a document, the next thing one could imagine to a documentary image of the future. How would that work? Basically, a neural network calculates a video one frame into the future, just always predicting the next frame, and comes up with this kind of representation. And this is a recording. I will show you the tool later. I would just like to briefly acknowledge the people who have supplied the algorithm and the web tool, which are Damien Henry from Paris and Jules Laplace, who has made the web tool. So basically, as you can see, in the future, the fire will be out of control for some reason. And that's basically the main point, which I will talk about. Why is the fire out of control? What does that mean, and how come? And actually, I used this tool to make a lot of other clips, which will be shown in videos, which hopefully are going to be done soon. But anyway, so I showed this to my daughter, and the first thing she said is, "Oh, well, that's obvious, because AI is like fire anyway." And I was like, "What?" And she was like, "Oh, it's very obvious, I mean, this is like the perfect training footage for a neural network to pick up upon, because there is a kind of more or less rhythmic motion. There is a defined probability space and some kind of variation in that, so it's kind of obvious that this would work very well." But it immediately struck me that I had the feeling that she had touched upon something much wider ranging. And so then I started to think about, okay, what do all these different technology, which are pooled under this kind of misleading name, artificial intelligence, what do they have in common with fire? And of course, fire is by far, I think, the most important technology that mankind has ever sort of partly mastered. It's the only tool that actually has managed to modify human bodies and brains and actually produced modern humans through the technology of cooking, which seems to have modified digestion and brains, thereby creating the species we belong to. But also it seems to have contributed to the rise of language as such. This is the so-called campfire hypothesis. Language was developed when people were sitting around a campfire in a cage and were gossiping all the time. So this is where language apparently was created. But also fire seems to have introduced some degree of division of labor, because you needed people in order to, collect wood, but also manage the fire, rekindle it, maintain it, and so on and so on. And there is also an interesting theory which is called the grandmother hypothesis, the grandmother as the creator of culture, because through fire and cooking people were able to live longer, so grandmothers could create society by childcare. So I think all these, and of course there's lots of other things that were enabled through fire, which relate to navigation, for example. People could migrate into colder regions. They were creating landscape, by burning down parts of it, thus creating pathways to travel on. Or they could also navigate into the interior of caves. They could basically navigate darkness for the first time. But I really want to focus on one small thing, which is also mentioned when it comes to fire as a technology, which is called time colonization by anthropologists. And I wondered, whoa, what is this? And it's kind of very simple. It means basically the extension of human activities into the night. It's the conquest of the night for human activity. And of course, it goes without saying that fire is also can be weaponized easily. It's a terrifying weapon, and also a weapon which equalizes, power relation between humans, because a child can basically kill a whole group of people using fire under certain circumstances. And so, because fire is also dangerous, obviously, it ended up being successively being black-boxed and domesticated, first by, for example, creating combustion engines, trying to sort of trap the spark of ignitions inside boxes. But arguably, one could also say that electricity as such, which is the base for any kind of computation, is a sort of black-boxing of ignition. And also equally, one could say that these kinds of fires, even though they have been black-boxed and domesticated, have never been, tamed completely, which seems to be very obvious in the case of combustion engines, where the sort of black-boxing and containing of fire seems to have created, through climate change, a situation which creates, a much bigger propensity for fires starting everywhere, a whole new fire regime, as people who deal with fire professionally call it. But having said that, this is about fire, so how does machine learning relate to it? And the question is, we don't know, because we don't really know yet what it is and what it's going to do. All these technologies are emerging, and it may turn out that they may have as far-ranging consequences as fire had on humankind. But it hasn't really happened yet. If you listen to the rest of my talk, you may agree with me in saying, fortunately, it hasn't happened yet. But anyway, there is no way of directly comparing AI and fire right now, because it hasn't really happened yet. But I would really like to look at this small example of time colonization, because this is something that both machine learning and neural network-based prediction relate to very closely. And how is that? How does, so to speak, stochastic time colonization work? And you can see it very clearly in this video. You train a neural network on a as big as possible corpus on past data, and then basically prolong the vector of the patterns that were recognized within these data to prolong it into the future, which means that essentially the past is colonizing the present, because of course the future training data are not available yet. But also there is another thing that happens, or seems to happen lately, which was articulated by a Google researcher called Ali Rahimi, who, and this is a quote, put it bluntly in his presentation: machine learning has become alchemy. Why is this? Because researchers themselves often don't understand why a certain output is generated from a certain input, the so-called black box problem, which you will all know. And he said, I would like to live in a society whose systems are built on top of verifiable, rigorous, thorough knowledge and not on alchemy. So at least some, people working in machine learning are under the impression that at least some prediction using machine learning and neural networks is actually divination. And just to return to this example of fire, divination with fire has a quite long history. It was called pyromancy in the Renaissance and even before. And this is, interestingly, a time which I think is really close to our time, in that science and magic are really very closely related to one another. Science and magic form, so to speak, the backsides of one another. It's, for example, quite well known that Isaac Newton, for example, he was much more into magic and then into physics and gravity, for example. So much, and this is a quote again, much of Newton's research into the movement of heavenly bodies may have been influenced by his belief that there were invisible occult forces at work. This was his hypothesis. It turned out to be gravity, but actually he thought there was some kind of magic at work. But ironically, most of his writing on this topic were destroyed in a fire, which was started by his dog, of all people. And he also, maybe this is for the better, because he seems to have predicted that the world would end after 2060. He was kind of certain about that. We have a sort of fictional description of pyromancy in the series Games of Thrones, which my daughter forced me to watch, front to back. So in this series, there are people who use pyromancy to establish some sort of fascist regime, trying to, or sacrificing actually human beings to fire and their own idea of, how controlling fire also means to control power. And one could really think that this flavor of pyromancy has also been domesticated lately on social media in the form of flame wars and other, burning activities or call for burning activities. But historically, one can say that almost paradoxically, pyromancy has also sparked, almost by mistake, some amazing cultural achievements, like, for example, the first forms of Chinese script appear on turtle shells, which were tossed into the fire for divination purposes, and then they would crack, and according to the crack and the relation of the cracks to the question, one could sort of divine the answer. But it's the first time that early form of Chinese script has been recorded. So, I mean, pyromancy has both these aspects. On the one side, a tendency towards fascist violence, but then also by mistake, some other things can appear, like, for example, the discovery of gravity or writing. And I was really influenced in thinking through all of this by a very interesting book, which is called The Politics of Divination. Actually, Tom recommended it to me, and written by a person called Joshua Ramey, and he is mostly focused on algorithmic prediction in finance mainly, and he tries to analyze, financial prediction algorithms as some kind of repressed form of divination. And why is that? Why is that repressed? Because he says at the end of the day, all forms of prediction are trying to basically deal with the terror of chance, if you will, because the only thing we can predict for sure is that until this day, all humans have died. So there's a 100% chance of human mortality, and people are terrified about it, and they are seeking for sets of rituals, to contain the terror of chance. And if these rituals, which he thinks could be located in traditional divination systems, if they get sort of eliminated from society, then they will sort of reappear everywhere and also almost emerge within so-called rational systems like science, mathematics, definitely probability theory, and so on and so on. So if there is no, let's say, social location for divination and for dealing, with the fear of risk and mortality, then this will somehow escape and manifest in places which are perceived as being rational. And I think definitely this is what we're seeing right now with this sort of irrationalist prediction emerging within engineering, for example, but also in all sorts of sciences connected to probability. And we see that most definitely in the public discourse around AI, the monster, dictator, singularity, blah, 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 and so on, or the cute female, AI. So all of these sort of mythical figures can be seen also as reflexes of this kind of irrationality creeping into seemingly rational scientific discourse. So basically, if we analyze all these as repressed forms of divination, why is that? As I said, there is no social space, or the social spaces, to deal with the terror of chance and somehow work through it, if you like, are no longer there. There is no space for divination as a social and shared activity. And Ramey argues, and I don't think I really agree with him, but he sees, this kind of potential in what he calls traditional divination practices that focus not on, prescribing the future and giving really precise, verdicts about what the future holds, but, deliver some kind of opaque and intransparent prediction, which he thinks, and here we hark back to the topic of navigation, could be thought of as a map. So for him, socially useful divination is a divination that is more like a map than an answer. You use it like you would use a flame to see where the wind is blowing from. This is his idea of the social role of divination. And I would like to add another thing which has really struck me, and I don't have an answer for why this is, but it occurred to me that the more the past through prediction colonizes the present, and the more the future becomes, so to speak, predictable and prescribed and emptied out and appropriated most of all, the more the present becomes completely unpredictable and random and risky and precarious. And I have no idea what this correlation means, if there is actually a causality in there or not. But this, I think, is a very important point. So let me now show you my tool, the political pyromancer. And it is not a real-time tool, so you will see it in hang on, what is this? Why is it not working? So, okay, I need to refresh it. That's the first thing with prediction, it never works. Okay. Yeah, I have been working with this thing for so many months now, and it's very frustrating. But anyway, let me see if I can manage. And these are all the other networks in there. I have a little zoo. But the one I want to show to you is the campfire, obviously. So let me see. Here, short crackling campfire. Here it is. Okay, start. Let's wait for this to happen. So, and as you see, I have kind of renamed all these functions. And what you see now is basically an almost straight output of the training data. I first have to launch the political ignition in order for it to start to predict. Hello. Start predicting, please. Okay. And then we have all these different parameters, right? So for example, we can accelerate it, then it just becomes faster. It's not very interesting. You have to know that most of these buttons doesn't work. So that's the first thing everyone should know about machine learning. This is also when it's called proprietary button, where you pay 5 million to change something, but here you waste 5 million to do something, and as you will see, you can move them any way you want. It wouldn't really change anything whatsoever. But there are actually a couple of buttons. Now it has ceased to work completely. Let's see what happens. I have to restart it. There are a couple of buttons which really do make quite a difference. So let me see. Huh? It's not burning. What's the problem? Okay, so while it's processing, I think the internet might be too slow. That's probably the problem. But let me tell you that basically almost the only things that do work is this hate factor. There are two factors in here. One is the so-called 0.14 factor, which I extracted from an Austrian political algorithm which calculates the job chances of women versus the job chances of men. You know that all these things are starting to be automated now, and they figured out that the job chances of women are 0.14 smaller than men's job chances, so this is being factored into deciding whether they will get additional job training or not. And here, if you yank around ARIA Nachweis, then it will go all over. Then it's basically Valhalla. Yeah. Yes, but I think this is a model, a quite accurate model, I would say. And here you see the loss function, sadness, depression, breakdown, burnout is a really important factor, pressure, distortion. But here are also some buttons for generation of future, right? They sort of work sometimes, sometimes. But you can at least try. What was I going to say? Yes. Oh, yes. What I was going to say is I think this is a quite accurate model of how machine learning prediction actually works in the political field. It is, of course, always a machine or machinery or a tool that has a lot of different political parameters, and once you change the parameters, something happens or something doesn't happen. But the future is not produced, ex nihilo, which is something which many people think happens, that just because it's a machine, it will objectively tell you the truth. This is something that, for example, Trevor Paglen calls machine realism, or Bifo calls, what is Bifo calling it? Prescription, an act of prescriptive future. And the idea is that just because it's some piece of advanced technology, it will automatically calculate some kind of truth. Well, it doesn't. You see all these parameters which go into modifying the prediction and creating the prediction, and you can, I think, really use this as a model to ignite society in more general terms using all these parameters. Yes, so basically maybe the last idea I really want to mention is when I saw this, it reminded me, or it just became very clear to me that what we are talking about here, or the sort of situation that this thing is condensing more or less unconsciously, is a situation literally of planetary burnout, right? Where basically you yourselves may be the energy sources a machinery is drawing from, is drawing attention from you, is drawing labor from you, is drawing data from you, or other kind of measure points. But one could also, of course, see it in a wider ecological context, that, systems are looking for energy sources to exhaust and to burn, thus creating what one could call some form of planetary burnout. And maybe this is a useful tool to predict, but maybe also, to at least slow down or reflect the kind of planetary burnout we find ourselves in. And also there's another aspect to it. I was thinking about all the traditional fire myths, of course, when I was writing this text. It's Prometheus, the myth of Prometheus being one of the most prominent, the guy that steals the fire from the gods and gets punished and so on. But I thought maybe now we are in a sort of inverse kind of situation when actually the immortals are stealing back the fire from humans. It's just that the immortals are now crazy transhumanists, that try to drink blood from young people or something like Peter Thiel's to become immortal. So maybe this kind of immortals are now more or less trying to steal fire back and to black box it behind proprietary screens to limit access. And in this kind of perspective, one could think of Prometheus as a kind of very complicated and also ambivalent, open source story, a story of access, which gets very, very complicated if you think through its implications for machine learning, so to speak, where I personally have become completely scared of the myth of open source, which I myself have been advocating for a long time, but I think we are at a stage where actually it becomes kind of too dangerous to have everything around in the open, because it can be just appropriated and used way too quickly. And this is why I had a handwritten script of this whole code, and I burned it and buried the ash in a cave. Okay, so let me give you one last prediction. I mean, obviously what you saw is that this is a kind of performative experiment on Joshua Ramey's idea of decolonizing divination. He says one has to decolonize divination from the stranglehold, of algorithmic logic, of financial systems and so on. One has to recreate a chance where divination becomes a social activity, a shared activity to commonly deal with precariousness, with the risk of dying, with the impossibility to really predict the future. And you see that I have now started to implementing this by, essentially telling campfire stories of grandmothers, sitting around a campfire. But I also think that there is a real prediction to make from this, which may actually be 100% true. And this is, of course, that, in Bifo's words again, the inevitable never succeeds. And what always succeeds is the unpredictable. And what do I mean by that? There is a lot of, funny, but also problematic, anyway, funny anecdotes from Nicholas Taleb's book, which is called The Black Swan. And he has a lot of anecdotes from probability. And he has this one story about a casino that came up with a foolproof algorithm, so the bank would always have a profit at the end. But then suddenly the casino filed bankruptcy. So what had happened? The robbers had just taken away the money, and the algorithm didn't account for this. So basically, what happened was actually the thing that was not covered by the algorithm. And then looking at this still of the campfire, I think the one thing one can almost for sure predict from it, that if you look, at all these dark clouds in the sky, it is very certain that it will rain. Thank you.
Hi, I'm James. I'd also like to say thank you very much to the Hackaway, to e-flux, to the Harun Farocki Institute for inviting me along this evening. Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you to Hito for that awesome talk, which I now have to follow. I was asked to, and I wanted to speak a bit about self-driving cars and potentially their relationship to navigation and possibly everything else, and that's what I'm going to do. The story I pick to tell about self-driving cars starts in New York City in 1925. Imagine a completely empty car in 1925, which is roughly this period, stood just kind of on the curb on Broadway. It's an empty car, and a man just steps onto the running board and he raises his hand, and without anything else happening, the car engine starts. And it shifts into gear, and it lurches away from the sidewalk and straight into the traffic, and it heads down Broadway, followed by police motorcycles. It's weaving from side to side. It misses a milk wagon. It just scrapes past a fire engine. Somewhere on Fifth Avenue, the car makes a wild swing. The man on the running board lunges for the steering wheel, but he's too late, and the car plows directly into another one that, not coincidentally, is full of photographers and movie men who are trying to capture an image of this autonomous vehicle, the very first driverless vehicle. The whole thing starts right there in this collision between the self-driving vehicle and the image that we're trying to capture of it and trying to watch it in the same moment. This is not it, but this is another one. But the original car, the one from 1925, was called the American Wonder, and it was the invention of the man who was stood on the running board during that first experiment down Broadway, who was an ex-army engineer called Francis P. Houdina. And it was driven by a car driving behind, broadcasting radio waves to direct it as it drove. The guy was called Houdina. That's not a mispronunciation. But in July of the same year, the illusionist Harry Houdini broke into his offices and accused him of stealing his mail because they had such similar names that the post office would get confused. So not only do you have this network of associations of the car, the ghost, the illusion, the image, the crash, you also have an actual magician kind of tangling in a bar fight with the original inventor of this thing. Those are all true stories. Up to today, and this is the state of the art in self-driving cars, Tesla's vehicles. This one, the Model S, was the first production car to offer something like full automation. It has a feature which comes as a kind of software download to the vehicle, which is called autopilot. The vehicle is kind of pretty much capable of doing everything itself, some things itself. It's limited quite heavily by law about what's actually possible to engage, but it uses a combination of radar, sonar, video cameras, and machine intelligence to drive itself potentially for hours under all kinds of different weather conditions. One of those laws is that the drivers are required to keep their hands on the wheel at all times, and there's sensors to make sure that they're doing this, and they receive audio and visual warnings if they fail to do so. In May of 2016, a man called Joshua Brown was driving, or rather being driven, by his Tesla Model S along a highway in Florida when it crashed into the side of a large truck, killing him. He was using autopilot at the time of his death, and in a blog post a few days afterwards, Tesla stated that a truck had turned to cross the highway in front of his car, and neither Mr. Brown nor the car's sensors had managed to register this event. Neither autopilot nor the driver, they wrote, noticed the white side of the tractor-trailer against a brightly lit sky, so the brake was not applied. Mr. Brown was a huge Tesla fan, and he posted a number of videos on YouTube in the months prior to his death showing off the features of his car. This is one of them. It was posted to YouTube where last I checked it was still available. It's called Autopilot Saves Model S. If I played the audio, you'd be able to hear the Malcolm Gladwell audiobook that Brown is listening to, and his exclamation of "holy shit" as the car suddenly swerves as this large truck tries to move into his lane. The car does effectively save his life in this moment. Elon Musk subsequently retweeted this video, and Brown told a neighbor that for something to catch Elon Musk's eye, I can die and go to heaven now. Before the crash, investigators revealed that Brown had been driving for 36 minutes without his hands on the wheel and had ignored 7 separate warnings. While the truck should have been visible to the driver for a full 7 seconds leading up to the crash, a portable DVD player was found in the wreckage, and the truck driver involved in the accident testified that Brown had been watching a Harry Potter movie that could still be heard playing in the wreckage of the accident. In 1971, in an essay for the Automobile Association's magazine Drive, J.G. Ballard wrote that if I were to condense the whole of the present century into one mental picture, I would pick a familiar everyday sight, a man in a motor car driving along a concrete highway to some unknown destination. I think, he continued, that the 20th century reaches almost its purest expression on the highway. Here we see all too clearly the speed and violence of our age, its strange love affair with the machine, and conceivably with its own death and destruction. And so the Ballardian reading of such a moment will be then that the self-driving car is the automation of that death drive. Joshua Brown, and potentially all of us, are victims of something that's called by psychologists automation bias. This is a well-documented psychological tic which has been tested at all kinds of levels. One of the most interesting places it's been tested is on pilots, airline pilots. These are people with tens of thousands of hours of flight experience, of incredibly complex environments. and they're placed inside aircraft simulators, and then they're fed a simulated version of some kind of incident, and it's watched how they respond. And what's been found time and time again in repeatable experiments is even these people who have tens of thousands of hours of flight experience, who are incredibly skilled and experienced people, who know precisely what it is they should do in this particular moment, if in that moment they're given a prompt by an automated system, by an autopilot or some other kind of technological device, they'll do what the machine says straight away without question, even if it leads to their simulated deaths. Our brains are in some way wired to take the advice of automated systems over our own experiences when offered them in moments of stress or crisis. Automation bias is generalizable to, I think, to what US park rangers have started to call death by GPS, which is an increasingly common phenomenon in desert tracts of the US, in the mountains and even elsewhere, where people will follow the bright red line of their GPS guidance system into the desert or up the mountain, even as the ground becomes more arid, even as the road starts to kind of disappear around them. People will follow this into Death Valley without water, without food, without anything that will sustain them. Other cases have been documented of people driving into lakes or even into the sea because the device in front of them tells them that this is the way in which they need to be headed. This pathway system, this guidance system, this technological augmentation of our navigation plays out in other ways, in all kinds of strange ways, I think. This is an image of an Amazon warehouse. Amazon do something quite interesting in their warehouses that's been taken up by lots of other kind of large logistics businesses. Within Amazon warehouses, goods are stored according to a system that's called chaotic storage. Chaotic storage isn't really chaotic. It's chaotic from a human perspective, but not from a machine's perspective. Goods within Amazon warehouses are stored not like we would store physical objects, but more like bits on a hard drive, where they're most algorithmically efficiently to be placed. So if you're having to find a range of goods for a customer's order, it's not really very useful if all of the books are here and all of the DVDs are half a mile away at the other end of this warehouse. What you want to do is mix all of those things up according to the frequency with which they might be required. That's hugely efficient. It also makes this space completely unnavigable to an unaugmented human. To a human eyes, this appears to be a random assemblage of stuff. The only way to navigate it successfully is to use one of the wrist-mounted terminals or handheld devices that Amazon workers use to navigate these spaces, essentially a form of indoor GPS, which guides them from location to location around this completely inhuman space. The only way to fulfill one's quota, to perform one's job, is to follow without question and as fast as possible the directions of this device that you're mandated to cover. And of course, if you're wearing one of those handheld devices, a whole bunch of other forms of kind of monitoring and surveillance become possible. The system knows exactly where you are at all times. It knows when you go to the toilet. It knows when you stand still for too long. It knows when you stop near another worker, perhaps to discuss the possible benefits of unionization. It allows for the complete de-skilling of the workforce. You need no skills to work in this place apart from the ability to follow the directions on a handheld device, so the company has no interest in your training, further education, or otherwise. All of us, increasingly, as we follow these kind of automated systems, are tracked and maneuvered in much the same way as people are inside these kinds of spaces. But there's something off about this reading as well for me that bothers me quite a lot. Because going back to the self-driving car, there's something about the self-driving car properly understood, which for me says is the opposite of autonomous. The vision of the automobile that Ballard proposed, the 20th century automobile, equipped with a paper map and a couple of jerry cans of fossil fuel, could light out for parts unknown under the sole control of the rugged individualist, and attain that kind of ideal of 20th century freedom, where the self-driving car is enmeshed in an infrastructure of renewable, potentially energies, electrical power, satellite signals, slippy maps, over-the-air updates, and kind of complex networked human desires. The self-driving car is not autonomous. It has to continually re-examine and revise its view of the world, adapting to and learning from its experiences, and connecting with other vehicles and kind of travelers on the road to learn about the local conditions. And its perceived intelligence is always and utterly a networked intelligence. It's not the individualist forms of intelligence that we perhaps fear more. And far from being a vehicle for individualism and those selfish freedoms, it could potentially necessitate some return to the communal and the social in the form of those networks. And the way I see it is this has been borne out to some extent in the development of self-driving cars. This is one of Google's earlier versions of their self-driving car, which they seem to have completely binned now, because basically these things are not working out, just to be clear. But this is one of the versions. The first Google cars and all the self-driving initial recent tests, they relied on an internal mapping system. There was this belief that you could basically take a complete and total map of the world, install it into the vehicle would faithfully follow that without any problems. We can all imagine the immediate terrible edge cases that result from trying to put all this knowledge into one vehicle and not have it pay any attention to everything around it, and indeed they did. But the arrival of machine learning, coupled with the realization that actually the car needs to be aware of the world, has totally changed that experience. This is one of the leaders in self-driving car development turned out to be NVIDIA, whose work this is, who make computer chips, not cars. Like everything else, everything is computers now, and a self-driving car is essentially a computer with wheels. And the difference between this and the way that Google envisaged self-driving cars being built is that it has to constantly look at the world, it has to see it, it has to be aware of its environment, and try to read it and sense it and understand it in some kind of meaningful way. I was fascinated by these attempts to see and read the world in this way, to understand it as a shared habitat. And I wanted to see how far it was possible to push this kind of democratization, potentially, or socialization of these intelligent vehicular systems. So a couple of years ago, I spent several weeks driving around the mountains of central Greece in a car that I fitted out with several cheap webcams, a homemade accelerometer, an app that I wrote for my phone, velcroed onto the steering wheel, this very crappy laptop on the passenger seat, recording all of this data from around me. And so what's happening here is the machine is essentially watching me drive. All of that data is then taken and fed into a neural network that tries to replicate the behavior that the car should do faced with the view in front of it, the speed that I would drive it. I'm a terrible driver, so it's being trained on something horrible. But it was being trained on my behaviors. It tried to copy me, essentially, to learn from me how to do this. And I fed all of that information into an open source machine learning system very similar to the ones used by Google, Tesla, Uber, and all of these groups who are developing it. And by watching my driving, the software learned to drive itself, not, as I say, terribly well, and only under very simulated conditions. But broadly, the experiment worked up to that point. And more to the point, it did this not on the test tracks of Bavaria or the kind of freeways of Southern California, but among the towns and villages of Greece, a place with a very different material, economic, and mythological history and present. And it didn't really strike me until I was doing it. This wasn't part of the plan. I'd only recently arrived in Greece, and this was a project that I sort of brought with me. But like all these things, they take on a very different meaning depending on where you do it. This is actually Mount Parnassus. I was literally driving up Mount Parnassus while I was training this AI. And in Greek mythology, Parnassus is home of the muses. It's the home of art. So to train a robot to climb Mount Parnassus is perhaps something different than training it to drive you all the way to the bank. It's something quite akin to attempting to replace the artist with this kind of technological hack on artistic understanding of the world. And it was at that that the one thing I was trying to do was trying to make the car get lost. That was one of the things I was trying to train it to do. But what I really needed to do was actually like address rather more head-on what this drive for automation might do to me and to many of us. As a result, one of the things that I made was I constructed a trap for the self-driving car. The autonomous trap takes the form of 2 nested circles, one solid, one dashed. This is the universal, at least mostly European symbol for no entry. So by surrounding the car entirely with the no entry symbol, you create a magic circle that by its own rules, the car is not allowed to leave. You kind of trap it within its own programming like a demon inside a salt circle, which that is. So I had this idea that on one level I was trying to reprogramming the machine to make it act in some more communicative, more interesting way. This idea of getting a car that would get lost primarily, rather than one that would take me directly from A to B that I would kind of engage with. And on the other hand, retaining the possibility of saying stop, of actually putting a straight barrier to even the development of this technology as something that we should be able to say that actually we do not want this. But I also realized in doing so that actually this is, while an incredibly aggressive gesture, I realized it was also something else, which was it was the kind of attempted creation of a common ground, of a shared space, a space of kind of mutual communication. Because the thing about the trap is that it's visible to both human senses and machine senses. It's found, it lives in the space of the world in the form of the lines, which is visible to both us and to the machine. And it's this space that I increasingly find most interesting, because we have for some time, and due to developments of machine learning and other things, we live more and more amongst other forms of intelligence that we cannot understand. And the need to find shared common spaces within those is becoming increasingly paramount. To finish, I was just going to tell a story that I was told to me by Franco Bifo Berardi, who's also already been mentioned this evening, because the autonomous trap was inspired in part by a story that he tells about networked automotive systems and about resistance. In October of 1978, the Italian Premier Andreotti was scheduled to visit Bologna to give a speech, and the city's autonomists were discussing how to protest. And according to Franco Berardi's telling, a comrade named Pino arrived at the assembly, and while everyone else was arguing, he just opened up his coat, and it was hung with all kinds of keys and gadgets and bits of wire. And he said that we must use technology to defeat capitalism, because the keys in the coat were the keys to the city's traffic lights. And the autonomists took them and they spread out across the city. And on the day of Andreotti's speech, they used the keys to turn every light in the city red, causing instant gridlock. And Andreotti never left the airport. It's a good story, but it leaves open this question of the map and how we access it. The map that is not and has never been the territory is still not seen by any of us. It's embedded within all of these technologies. It's written down as lines of code. It's increasingly becoming part of the dimensionality of neural networks that we have very little access to. So we need to retain strategies of resistance And we also need to develop entirely new ones of engaging with both creatively and communally, right? As a kind of shared way of engaging with the ways in which these technologies shape and direct our lives in incredible myriad of ways. If we do not, then we too are in danger of failing to distinguish between the tractor-trailer and the bright white sky, like Ballard's driver trapped in the automobile with our hands on the wheel, being taken in the most comfortable and efficient manner straight into the side of that truck. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you both for really incredible presentations in very short time. Actually, we don't have that much time left, so I think we should maybe keep it brief and turn it over to the audience as quickly as possible. My one question actually has to do with what I wrote to you, both about before I get a neck ache. What I wrote to you about earlier about the end of the map. This was actually something that Anselm brought up with a version of our description for the conference, where we had said in our description of the conference that navigation begins where the map ends, right? And so this already sets up a quite ambiguous idea of navigation, either following the map or actually following some kind of extrasensory perception of world. And both of you, in a way, deal with this in very interesting ways. But the point that Anselm brought up is the kind of common modernist trap, actually, no, of projecting the wild into the end of the map. And this really confused me, because of course also it seems like a kind of a dialectical bind already. The map produces, if the metro breaks down, if public transportation breaks down, and you have to make your own way, what you experience is something similar to there's a sudden experience of the wild produced by many of these kind of machines of vision and mapping. And it has a lot to do, I think, with a kind of conquest of the unknown that you speak about, but also the colonization of the night by fire. At the same time, you describe fire as a kind of open sourcing of power, a Promethean opening of power to an open source, something which is available to everyone. So the question of the wild seems to also run through and where it actually lands in relation to knowledge, and seems to run through this presentation, and I kept thinking of it also, and also in your book you deal a lot with the conquest of the unknown as a computational principle, but then strangely you have a caged animal in your trap. You seem to deal with automation itself as a kind of a wild, and you seem to have entrapped. You seem to have trapped a wild animal. How do you? And maybe I begin with you, James, if you don't mind. How does this caged animal of the self-driving car relate to also your previous work on mastering the unknown?
I don't know, when you talk of the wild in that way, and particularly with Hito's sort of discussion of the fire and its relationship to AI, I mean, I see the campfire as a similar kind of caging of the wild, in that sense, something that we always know can kind of escape in sparks, that's always an unstable kind of caging. And it's also increasingly how I find myself partly as product of this project, kind of thinking about AI or what I prefer increasingly to think of as other intelligences rather than artificial intelligences, as a kind of wildness that we're living with. I really struggle with the idea of the kind of end of the map, because I think until we get a lot further from this planet, there's no terra incognita, and that's always been a really troubling description anyway. But we've brought that wildness kind of inside now. And one of the things that I think about a lot at present is the extent to which artificial intelligence, when it's not being used purely to oppress us, which it is and will be frequently, is also a kind of training for a kind of re-engagement with the wild. Because we have to come to some kind of accommodation with a really crazy form of power that we do not fully understand, that is deeply alien to us. And we're going to keep encountering it more and more and more. And I think that contains a kind of incredible possibility for rethinking our relationship to all the other intelligences that exist in the world already, and that we also have always characterized as wild and other, rather than and sought to master them, rather than like engage with them in some kind of productive and hopefully mutually beneficial way.
Makes me think of this expression, to test things in the wild, used by Silicon Valley when Facebook is changing its algorithm or something like that. It's being tested in the wild, meaning there is no other, testing phase, which would become contained maybe, partly, but it's always already unleashed, right? Mm-hmm. So you are basically experimenting with it as you go along. There is no buffer zone, so to speak, and this is the recreation of the so-called wild, by way of this sort of uncontrolled and deregulated, probably this is the better word, totally deregulated form of knowledge production and experimentation. It's the production of the wilderness. And not because it exists and the public is the wild per se, but by, unleashing deregulated experimentation upon it and doing, psychological experiment, whatnot, the wild is created, I guess, no? And the wild, of course, is inside the car by forms of this domesticated ignition, which is so far removed now from human interference. I mean, when I saw the Beetle, you could just fix it by beating it, basically. No, that's not possible. I mean, people cannot fix Audi, I don't know what these latent models are called, right? It's beyond basically distributed craftsmanship. So, yeah. So by basically trying to domesticate the wild and entomb it and enshrine it and make it proprietary also, it becomes even more out of control somehow. It's amplified and enhanced.
Yeah, I was thinking while you were talking of the stories last year about American Midwest farmers who had to hire Ukrainian hackers to fix their tractors because John Deere, the main sort of combine maker, had so entirely locked down the control systems of these vehicles and charged them vast amounts of money to do it, that these farmers were learning about Bitcoin so that they could pay Ukrainian hackers to give them like malware for their own vehicles, which is on one level, as you say, like a talk of...
Also the tractors were not sold to the farmers but leased, right? So they basically, they were just... had to buy them, but then they didn't own them. It's the same with Adobe. They have the same kind of franchising system. Right. Yeah.
But I mean, who has learned any form of hacking didn't learn it as a specific response to those kind of control systems. Essentially, as they lock it down, then we learn the hacks around.
Mm-hmm.
Should we take some questions from the audience?
Yeah, thank you. Is that working? Yes. We saw how humans were more likely to follow machines than other intelligent humans. So I wonder if there's any way to, feed an AI or something that tells us what to do, like to say, okay, I'm a bit off topic now, but to how we can save the world. Like, I mean, there are scientists telling us how we destroy our planet. Maybe we could feed all this information in some super AI that then tells us, okay, till that point you have to do this, and then you have to do that. So is there any project or anything like that in the world already?
Do you have a secret research?
I'm not working on that. But yeah, maybe we should.
No, I mean, many people's old idea is that the real existing AI is the financial markets, because they are supposed to know everything and to be able to autonomously regulate and fix everything for the best. This was my initial idea, but then I realized that this is no longer true. The real existing AI, especially for people who work in the art world, is bureaucracy, actually. So this is much worse, but it is the case. That's the singularity. It happened.
Yeah, I always say that. I always say corporations, but on the same line. Like, they're large. Often they have legal personhood. They have actuators. They have processing rules. They're goal directed. That is the AI that we built a long time ago. It just turns out to be a really, really terrible one.
Yeah. It requires burnout. I mean, literally. Yeah.
But there's the super interesting examples, I would say, are the ones. Again, I keep harping on about this, that are cooperative and collaborative in certain ways. Because what we have so far, machine learning, is very good at certain things, really terrible at others, but turns out to do really extraordinary things when actually working together with human thinking in very specific ways, whether that's game playing of human-computer teams. There's weird stuff. There's a case, I don't usually say nice things about Google, but they have a really nice program called the optometrist algorithm, working with fusion scientists who have incredibly complex scientific experiments, which are too complicated for a human mind to grasp. The AI basically helps them to, machine learning algorithm, helps to like reduce that set to something that humans can manage, and then makes decisions, and they pass it back and forth. And the result is a kind of thinking about the world which is fundamentally different to human or machine thinking alone. Because of the different ways search functions and different things work in our brains. So I think, yeah, we wandered off from your subject, but the point is, like, do not give this to an AI alone. But it genuinely does open up new forms of human thinking, and I still think it retains that possibility.
Thank you for those two great talks. I'm very interested in self-driving cars and have been for a long time. I was just curious as to what you might think as a technology of the human, because you just said something in relation to how the technology can make the human develop. But what is the outwitting nature? What would outwit the self-driving car apart from the trap?
They're quite easy systems to manipulate because they're incredibly trusting. There's an old computer science phrase which is garbage in, garbage out, which is that if you feed in bad data, you get bad data out. And there's all kinds of ways to manipulate these systems. They're also mostly flawed from the outset because they run on incredibly reductive data sets. And their model of the world is so simplified that there's the kind of bad outcomes are fairly easy to create or to manipulate or to crash. But most of them are also kind of black box systems that we don't actually have the access to because they're running inside larger systems of companies or systems that we don't have access to. But there's many examples of kind of weird perturbations you can do to these systems. They're called oppositional examples, is what they're called in the computer science lingo, which is essentially where you kind of reverse engineer a network to figure out how to to convince it that it's seeing something that it's not. It's a kind of a reverse engineering of the process, which is how I got to the trap by doing the same thing on humans, which is that I was thinking about gravity hills. Has anyone ever been to a gravity hill? This is a place, there's numbers of them around the world, where you can go and you stop your car and you take your handbrake off and you roll uphill. It's very disconcerting. And the reason this occurs, and the reason this is documented all around the world, is because it's in certain places, something happens in the topology, and the trees that grow there descend in a certain way, or something that it convinces the human brain that you're looking uphill when, in fact, sorry, you're not. It's not actually working that way. But like, we're all susceptible to, like, there's no perfect vision system or understanding system, I'm saying, and that glitch is always interesting.
Hello? Yeah, I'm also working with machine learning and the artificial intelligence in some way. And there's always a joke going on, is that how do you differentiate artificial intelligence and the machine learning? They say it's programming language. If you're programming with Python, then it's machine learning. If you're doing with PowerPoint, then it's artificial intelligence. So what this joke tells is that there's always two views going on, from the engineers who are really doing the job and everybody else who are commenting on this, not necessarily knowing what's happening. So very often we have this situation of like a vaccine and the anti-vaxxer scenario, is that anti-vaxxer have lots of fear about how a vaccine works, but vaccine developer have no question on these problems. So my question would be, what do you think, like the people who have no idea of technology, how exactly it works, like no pragmatic knowledge, how can they elaborate on how can they influence on the real development, instead of just expressing fear, but there are no any other possibilities? Is that clear?
No.
Sorry.
What is the question?
Also, the question is that there's lots of fear running around because of machine learning and artificial intelligence.
Oh, yes, so I get it. So I think one of the reasons is that it's pretty inaccessible to actually work with, or to see how it works. This is why I think that a tool like that is pretty useful, because then the functions and parameters are being sort of translated into something that at least can be accessed in a sort of intuitive way. But usually the threshold of access is pretty high, right? And I think that this is one, or maybe one of the main reasons why people have no idea how these things work, because actually you also know that many of these things are quite proprietary and difficult to handle. So how should they know? So I think that, some kind of base, and I always compare this to previous stages in technology. For example, let's say another sort of technological phase of progress was introduction of video camcorders. Let's say something like that, right? But anyone or many people could just lay their hand on this equipment and start experimenting with it. Now, this is much more difficult in machine learning. And other technologies, for example, virtual reality, the access level is just enormous. And these kind of translation tools are not very frequent. I mean, I don't know that many, right? Why this is the case, I don't know. Maybe, most probably, this is not interesting for engineers to, explain what they're doing, because they have other problems to solve, and there is no kind of public interest in doing that either. But I think, giving people the chance to really try to do something with it would be one of the first steps. To really understand that actually in this tool, most of these buttons are really not working. They aren't.
It's worth stressing after that, though, that like I think also most people working professionally on this have like quite frighteningly limited, not frighteningly, but seriously limited knowledges of it, or particularly of ways of talking about it and explaining it. There was, I remember this. There was one really long kind of New Yorker piece, I think, on New York Times piece on artificial intelligence, where the writer spends a couple of thousand words trying to get a senior machine learning specialist at Google to just explain to him what the hell is going on here. And he's particularly concerned with this idea of dimensionality, which is effectively one of the more inscrutable parts of machine learning, which is the fact that there's such a vast kind of matrix of numbers in multiple dimensions being ordered and processed at any one time that it extends beyond what a human mind can meaningfully grasp. And he keeps asking for this, and the computer scientist just turns around to him and says, look, I'm just not in the habit of trying to visualize high-dimensional numbers. And it just, for him, like, this is not, like, this attempt, particularly at visualization, the idea that you should be able to see this thing in some meaningful way is not something that kind of crosses his mind at all. Or not that it crosses his mind, but it's just not a meaningful way of even approaching the problem, which speaks perhaps to the fact that how do I phrase this? People who work a lot with these particular technologies think in a just different way, or have been trained to do it somewhere. But there's definitely some types, or there's something missing in our ability to communicate this thing, which is quite crucial, because I agree that the only way to understand these things in some way is to work directly with them. But I also feel all the time that that's such an insufficient way of like approaching our contemporary situation. Like we can't all learn to build these things. Like there's just not. It's not a solution that's going to work out. I'm all for like teaching kids to code or whatever, but like we can't all be coders, and we shouldn't have to be. And there's like something fundamentally missing if that's our only answer to this thing, which is a problem that I have as well. So yeah, translation into tools and these other kind of things, giving people just some kind of handle to hook onto it is like really crucial work.
Also to demystify these tools, right? That, prediction is possible, but also limited by a lot of different factors. Instead of, turning them into these mythical creatures that will tell the truth.
I know, but demystifying, but also re-mythologizing to some extent. I mean, isn't that the kind of deal with the campfire and the fire and the pyromancy, is to actually, just not to necessarily produce a better narrative, but to at least produce some different ones around this.
Tell a story about it, just make any sense of it.
This always seems to be the strange place where, of the wild, or the kind of this enchanted realm, where you never know whether it's the end of the machine and the beginning of something outside, or if the machine is giving out, the world is somehow trying to invade back inside, or if it's a very high level function of the machine, like the kind of controlled volatility of the market, or weather prediction that the computer cannot parse.
Well, I mean, this is the myth of the Enlightenment, right? Is that firelight spreads endlessly and infinitely, and continuously recedes, rather than kind of coming in back around you when you're least expecting it, or is kind of somehow there in your shadow all the time wherever you hold the light. I think that idea of an understanding of the world, of a kind of totalizing understanding, is what is clearly breaking down in the face of our new technologies in so many ways. So whether it's like, and our belief in kind of mythologizing has been largely banished by that belief that one total light truth will expand to encompass anything. That's not working. And so these other stories come in and kind of colonize or recolonize from behind.
The whole evening I'm trying to figure it out, because when I watch a wrestling game or boxing or something, I do understand that those are two different fields. Thank you. This is two different points of view about to be connected on the ring. And currently, throughout this whole evening, I'm not sure. It's really important for me just to get the context of what's going on. do you represent the idea of all the machines should be like a bit like, you know, slow down, and you're about like trying to get all the machines a bit boosting up just to get this. I'm just trying to figure out all the forces they have, because I obviously, you know, from in terms of like how all the image I have right now is really beautiful. I have like the golden curtains, I have you as the referee, I have like the pink power, I have the black power over here, and like one machine, like one is like the fire power, and like I'm really interested in overall situation. So thank you.
No, it is more like, you know, this chess game we have been talking about, where all the figures are white or black. You know, that's more the kind of game we're playing.
Yeah, that's so. My question is actually being raised from the moment that you've been speaking about, like people going to the situation in a time when the technology is actually becomes much more powerful than it happened to be before, and we should be a part of the human group as we share the knowledge with that you're like sharing with us. Like we need to share it back to you, and we need to return back to the fire, or otherwise like fire will like kind of like get back to us. And you're speaking about like robot cars that will like mostly like will help us or kill us as well. And it's just like I'm just curious, you know. I mean, like, and then also you're using the software, you're using like the predictive AI software to illustrate your point of view. And actually, I mean, like, don't get me wrong, but it's a funny thing that the software is not working in the moment of the representation, but like it's a part of like machine being like working with you as well. So I mean, like this really interesting situation we have right now. Thank you.
I think the main thing I was trying to say, if you socially ban, you know, basically mumbo jumbo or ritual or divination, you know, or just the fact that people are afraid and somehow need to deal with it from either the social sphere but also from the discussion of technology, then it will resurface within technology. But it will appear as something rational and something which you cannot question. And I think this is very dangerous. So I'd rather, you know, set aside a social sphere for any mumbo jumbo you can think of, you know, and just go for it. And have a science that at least is interested in what it is doing, right? Instead of being kind of content with some sort of alchemy. I mean, this is a bit unfair to say, right? But I think this, whatever works is fine. We don't even need to know why this is happening, and we will immediately implement it in the wild, meaning society. That's pretty scary. And then to basically describe this as cutting-edge science.
So, also, it's another moment. Nobody's taking my microphone out, so I'm like continue the conversation with you. I'm sorry, guys.
Maybe we should have a final question from the audience before we end. Okay.
Maybe James wants.
Patricia.
Do you want to respond?
I just wanted to ask, because I remember in a conversation we had a little while ago. I got the impression, I think you said something like, you wanted to put, I can't remember if you said you wanted to put all the AI in a box, or all the AI in a museum, or somewhere that would basically be kind of sealed away, let to play, but kind of separate. Has something changed in the process of this work?
No. Still, my idea is it should be in a cave, right? Yeah. Just like cave art, really. Yeah. So in a space where sometimes there is a, let's say, use for it, potentially, yes, definitely, but it should also be seen as something which should be, well, ideally put into a museum, right? Yes. Treated with also respect, but also treated as a danger, like fire.
Just to be a little bit more, or to get a little bit more on the optimism side, let's say, I'm just curious if there was any sort of commentary about this important issue raised about regulation, because when we're comparing it to other scientific fields, of course, in like medicine, you would have clinical trials. I mean, there's like all these procedures before it goes into the wild. I'm not saying they are imperfect, they are far from it, but nonetheless, there is some sort of like body, we don't just get medicine willy-nilly. And so I was wondering if you had any sort of comments about what could be applied in that, because I realized like the AI Now Institute, they just like released something like a couple months ago, these policies about like time limits on data sets and whatever, but perhaps you had some insights on how this could be better released in the wild when eventually.
Well, I don't know. I mean, just destroy the monopolies, for example. That's one. I think what the policy recommendation that I now are giving are very, very useful and should certainly be implemented. I'm just not sure if this really fixes the problem with the whole underlying economic framework around it, right? So while this persists, I'm not sure whether, tweaking an algorithm here and there to make it more ethical or to reduce bias is going to help, because at this point, I think bias is not a bug, but a feature, right? I mean, this is why there is a need for a lot of these systems. So, yes, but that's probably, that in itself is not going to help. What do you think?
I mean, yeah, these systems are already very much out in the wild, and embedded in a lot of the things we interact with, particularly online, but also through banking systems and so on and so forth every day. So they're already being like tested in the wild, as Hito said, on all of us. And there've been like attempts for some time to suggest like food labeling for algorithms, right? There's kind of like something on the box that tells you what's inside it. And I think that they are indeed noble efforts. But as we've also said, I think that I mean, AI or machine learning is the places where it's coming from, which is essentially inside large Western corporations, increasingly the US and Chinese governments. The places where this is germinating, is developing, are places which are not going to be subjected in any meaningful way to regulation anytime soon. And yeah, I see them as when used like that, essentially as attacks on the human kind of cognitive system, and by extension our kind of our physical well-being. And so the legislation is going to come at the level of care and protection rather than in kind of trying to restrain them.
There's a mic coming. I think we're now cutting into the drinks time. This is getting precarious.
It's almost time for us to be released into the wild.
Yeah, no, I think it connects to this question of literacy. I mean, what you've mentioned earlier, how far should we go to analyze these kind of conditions of production when we speak about learning, machine learning or artificial intelligence? I mean, yeah, different concepts. And I mean, Hito, you've said like there are so many bottoms that do not work. And this is like, is it surplus or is it this functionality built into the web tool? I mean, in order to kind of expose towards the human operating it.
Yeah.
I mean, the reason I'm asking this question of literacy, like a techno literacy, let's say, is, I mean, because it also regulates or deregulates relation to politics and democracy and dissemination, production of sociability. I mean, this is like, Jacques Derrida had this in this Echographies of Television. It's a whole section on what it means to not know about the way how, I mean, these technologies are working. It's something, a set of interviews from the early 2000s.
It's not working by default, but you have to figure out, how to make them work. It's a bit complicated. They don't just work by being there. So. But I mean, actually, I really think the default mode of technology is not to work, right? Everything else is a bonus. Yeah.
Thank you both, James, Hito.
Thank
Thanks
you
so much.